Mr. Chairman and guests at the head table, various provincial leaders, members of Parliament, distinguished guests, and friends from all across this country. May I try to express in a few words my very deep thanks and gratitude for your kindness and for the tributes which you have paid to my wife Irma and myself. Of course, I've been long enough in politics that I don't believe a lot of the malarkey that's been handed out. And nobody knows better than I do that I'm anything but the last word in efficiency or a great brain or any of those things. But I believe in this movement and the things it stands for. Irma and I have done our best to advance the interests of this movement, and your words of appreciation tonight really give us great comfort and great encouragement. There are so many things to thank you for. First of all, for having this glorious case. This is a pretty swell dump we're in, isn't it? This is Jerry Kaplan's idea of slumming. I haven't had much sleep the last few days with my wife being ill, and when I got up this morning I was sort of half asleep, and I went around the hotel and everything got more beautiful as I went around. I thought I must be in heaven. Then I met Gordon Brigden, and I knew I wasn't in heaven. Who in the hell would expect Gordon Brigden to be in heaven? And it wouldn't stay heaven very long. But I want to thank you for all the kind things you've said. I want to thank Gordon Pilkey particularly for this contribution to the Douglas Coldwell Foundation. If I can put in a plug, because after all it's your foundation. As you know, when I was leaving leadership of the party, they talked of buying us a car or a house or something of this sort, and I said, my wife and I said we wouldn't accept any gifts. And so they set up what we wanted to call the Douglas Foundation. I suggested to call it the Douglas Coldwell Foundation. They put some money into it. I've never drawn a dollar either in salary or expenses. I paid my own expenses just to make sure that nobody thinks it's a racket. And we've added to the fund. We can't touch the capital. In order to get tax deductibility, that money has to be there, and we can only spend the proceeds. We've used the proceeds to provide scholarships for students, organized a tour to China a couple of years ago. We have helped to get books printed. We just had a book printed, as you know, written by Jerry Harrop on the life of Stanley Knowles. And now I have someone working on the life of M.J. Coldwell. And there are complicated reasons why we were slow to get around to it, but we had difficulty getting hold of the material. But we now have the material, and we now have a writer. And this money, which has been presented tonight, will make it possible for us to get that biography underway, and I hope it will be printed and available for the National Convention. Because I want to tell you, out of my experience, one of the men, including people like Mr. Woodsworth and Agnes MacPhail and so many others, but one of the men who deserves the enduring gratitude of the Democratic Socialist Movement in Canada was M.J. Caldwell. Well, there are so many things I'd like to say, but the hour is late. I'm not going to take a lot of your time. I want to thank you for all the kind things you've done, for the kind things you've said, to say how delighted I am that the members of my family were able to be here. Shirley had to leave because she's in a play, I think it's called Wolf Boy or something, here in Toronto. The greatest disappointment, however, was that my wife Irma fell off a chair when she was standing up on it to fix a heat vent and fell and broke her arm, broke it very severely, and she's still in the nursing home suffering a good deal of pain. I'm hurrying back tomorrow morning. It's the first place I'll go from the airport is to see how she is. But I want to tell you, that my disappointment is nothing compared to hers. Mainly because she bought a new dress, especially to be here. and I'm disappointed because they won't take it back. But I shall go back, as will our children, our grandchildren, and tell Irma what a wonderful tribute we paid to her. I hope someday she'll see that film that was presented tonight, and I know that she will be thrilled as I and the members of my family were at this presentation, trying to depict something of what I've tried to do over the years. I'm glad you've had this get together, not in order to boost my ego, but because it's given us a chance to get together and think for a few moments about what this movement is and what this movement has done over the years. Like some of you, my memory goes back a long time. I remember attending the first convention of the Farmer Labour Party in 1932 in Saskatchewan. I became a candidate to fight in the election of 1934. Out of 35 candidates, and 55 candidates, only 5 were elected. Both Mr. Caldwell and myself were defeated. A lot of people said, you can't get a new party going. We carried on. Next year was a federal election. Mr. Caldwell and I ran again. Out of some 250 or 60 seats, we only won 7. 7 seats in the House of Commons. One of those later went across the floor to the Liberal Party. Those were not encouraging days. But there were men and women who believed, and believed devoutly, that the only hope for mankind was to build a society based not on greed and profit-making, but on service to mankind. And that conviction motivated people like Agnes MacPhail, Joan Osworthy, Grant McNeil, M.J. Caldwell, the Winches. I can go on down the list later, Clary Gillis, people like Stanley Knowles. These are the people who knew that victory in trying to upset a society motivated by greed and profit was not going to be easily thwarted. We had no illusions that if we went out and made a few speeches and had a couple of votes, that we would sweep into office. We knew that we stood against the press, all the media of public information, all the reluctance of people to accept change. We didn't go into this because we thought it would be easy, because we'd get great rewards. We knew that every step of the way we would have to fight. In some cases we'd lose, in many cases we did lose. But I can tell you that in those first conventions, I remember the Farmer Labor Convention I mentioned a moment ago in 1933, when the people in Saskatchewan were not only in the midst of a depression, but in the midst of a drought. It didn't rain for 7 years. Our fields were barren. And our people came in old tin model cars with a blanket and slept in the back of the car. They came riding on boxcars. They came walking and hitchhiking. And 2 years later, when we had the federal convention, first federal convention, 1935, 35, came from all over Canada, hitchhiking. No money for hotel bills, except for a very few people who could afford them. And they built this movement because they believed that it was possible for them to lay the foundations of a society in which their children and their children's children would have opportunities for a better life than anything they had enjoyed themselves. Sometimes the newspaper people say to me, what do you think about the polls? Only people who should worry about polls are dogs. Of course polls will go up and down. Of course there'll be times when you're popular and times when you're unpopular. And I noticed the press, suggesting that maybe we ought to get a new leader, a new federal leader, or a new provincial leader. That'll pick things up. Let me tell you that if you had St. Peter himself as the leader of the party, you would still have somebody saying, if you got rid of him, or if you got rid of her. And the irony is, if we were stupid enough to get rid of our leaders, they're the very people who 6 months later would be saying how foolish those people were to dispense with the services of one of the finest men or one of the finest women in this country. Surely we know better than that. As a matter of fact, if over the last 50 years we had worried about the polls, this party would be long dead. If we were to say we will only be working for the party when going is easy, when we win elections without any effort, when the campaign funds come rolling in, if we took that attitude, my friends, we'd get nowhere. So let's face up to reality. And the reality is that this country and the world of today needs democratic socialism more than any generation has ever lived or any people who've ever lived. I'll just briefly mention 3 problems. They're not new problems, but they are the most important problems facing our country, facing the human race, and we have to look at those problems and cope with them. The first is that we've got to provide jobs for all the people who are able and willing to work. $1.5 million Canadians out of work is a national disgrace. During the 30s, we had 1 million unemployed. We've got a bigger population now, but we had 1 million unemployed. And there were 1,000 excuses. We were in Parliament at that time, Mr. Woodsworth, a little group of 7. We got all kinds of excuses from the government as why we couldn't do anything about it. We hadn't the money. Where would we get the cash to do anything? There was no welfare, no unemployment insurance, no health insurance. Unemployed rode on the boxcars across this country. Then something happened. Hitler precipitated our country and most of Western countries into a war for survival. Do you know that overnight, governments that couldn't find any money found all the money they needed? Stanley Knowles and I can remember when the men were coming off the boxcars, been riding them back and forth across the country because they wouldn't allow them to stay in one place, and there was no welfare for single unemployed, coming off the boxcars in droves. I remember standing in Sudbury between changing trains when we were going down for the declaration of war, and these young men, some going to Toronto, some going to Winnipeg to join the armed services. And we took these young men for whom we had no jobs. We cleaned them up, cut their hair, deloused them, got them nice warm clothing, paid them a pay. They got pay every day, so much a day. Sent them off to fight to defend a country that hadn't had the decency to give them a decent living. In the last part of the war, I was already, by that time, Premier of Saskatchewan. And as soon as I got our first emergency session and some legislation on the statute books to protect the workers and the farmers, I jumped on a plane, and with the cooperation of General McNaughton, who was magnificent to me, went straight out to the Canadian Forces with a carte blanche from him to go wherever I wanted. I visited every Saskatchewan personnel in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all over Britain, all over Europe, wherever they were located. I was 3 months on the road living out of a haversack. And the officers were good to me. They'd give me a truck and say, you can get up and talk to the men, public address system. Sometimes talk to 200 or 300 men, sometimes 2,000 or 3,000. They'd cluster in around me and they'd say, Douglas, last time we saw you was when we were going through Sudbury. We were getting off the boxcar to go and join the army. What's going to happen to us when we get home? And I said, I don't know. But I can tell you, as far as our party is concerned, as far as a lot of other people are concerned, you're going back to a different kind of Canada. A country that found the money to fight a war is going to find the money to give you jobs, to put you to work, to make Canada a fit country for you and your children and your children's children to live in. Come back and help us do it. They came back. And no government dared at first after the war to tell them there's no money. And we made a lot of progress. We got universal old age pensions thanks to people like Stanley Knowles, and we got Medicare, and we got a lot of social improvements in this country. What has happened? The vested interests gradually have reclaimed control of this country. Once more, we are operating Canada for the benefit of the people who live off interest and profits. I'm not objecting to interest and profits. I'm objecting to a society that is operated solely for the benefit of those who control interest and profits. And what has happened since then? Today, 1.5 million unemployed in Canada. We ought to hang our heads in shame. The Liberal and Conservative parties ought to be covered with feelings of humiliation that they have allowed this country to get into this state. Why has it happened? It's happened because when people get awfully fed up with the Liberals, as they did under Mr. Saint Laurent, they all galloped over to the Conservatives under Mr. Diefenbaker, and we got trampled in a few seats as a result. And when they couldn't stand Diefenbaker anymore, they stampeded over to Mr. Pearson and to Mr. Trudeau. And now that Mr. Trudeau has become a nausea in their nostrils, they're all ready to stampede over to Mulroney. And we will not move one step forward, because all we're doing is going from side to side, and we're doing absolutely nothing to move toward the goals for which those men and women fought in the last war, and which we promised them. We promised them that we would remove those conditions when the war was over, and we haven't done it. Well, what are the future prospects? I don't want to sound too pessimistic in such a happy evening, but I want to tell you very frankly that the years ahead are going to be worse than the years we've come through. In the last 25 or 30 years, as Cliff Pilkey can tell you, automation has thrown the industrial workers out of jobs so that now they are a smaller and smaller component of the total population. But now the new machines, the automatic calculators, are going to do thousands of white-collar workers out of jobs. And they haven't got trade unions, and they are not organized. And they will be pilloried mercilessly by those who control the economy and operate it for their own profit. You stop and think of the state of affairs in this country and on this continent today, to say nothing of the rest of the Western world. I want to read to you. I brought it along so I could read it to you. You wouldn't think I was jazzing it up or something. But some years ago, President Carter of the United States appointed a commission of outstanding economists and sociologists, engineers, authorities on government, to look at the prospects of the future for the people of the United States. You hear very little about the report. I want to read just a paragraph of it, which was presented to President Carter before he left office. The report says, now read it slowly, if present trends continue, the world in the year 2000 will be more crowded, more polluted, less stable economically, more vulnerable to disruption than the world we live in now. Serious stresses involving population, resources, and environment are clearly visible ahead. Despite greater material output, the world's people will be poorer in many ways than they are today. And that's true. Why? Because we have lived off our national heritage. We've almost entirely, except for part of British Columbia, and that's only a matter of a few decades, we've virtually wiped out our forests. We have exploited our mineral resources, our oil, most of it to send to the United States. We have polluted our waters, our rivers, our lakes, our ocean shores, to the point where we face very serious prospects for the next generation. And with that situation, how do you justify having 1.5 million people unemployed? We should be taking our manpower and our women power and training them. We've got the instructors, we've got the scientific know-how. We should be training them to rebuild our forests, to clean up the water pollution in our lakes, our rivers, and our coastline. We should be recharging our efforts to increase the resources which we have in this country, rather than shipping them out at fire sale prices. We should be using all our resources to build decent homes for people, to build more hospitals, to provide the people of this country with the sort of standard of living that those men and women who fought in the last war believed would come as a result of their sacrifices. Well, that's the challenge. And when anyone tells you it, well, you know, we're getting along so well, we don't need a democratic socialist movement, NDP hasn't anything to contribute, I say to you that the only hope for Canada, the only hope for our economic survival, the only thing that will prevent us from social disintegration will be a democratic socialist program put into this effect, into this country, to take human ingenuity and apply it to our resources so that our people can begin to enjoy the wealth that they're capable of producing. That means bringing together the trade unions and the cooperatives, the veterans organizations, the New Democratic Party, and any other group who believe that people, by working together, can not only improve our present conditions, but can guarantee some measure of social and economic security for those who come after us. That's the challenge that faces our party. And when somebody tells you, well, we don't need the New Democratic Party anymore, that was fine in the Depression, that was fine after the war, but now we're rolling on to prosperity. Yes, we are. A small part of the population is rolling on to prosperity because they've picked the pockets of the rest of the people. They've managed to get to lend us money, and they live off the interest which we pay. And every time we have a big deficit, then they then sell us more bonds, and we have to pay them more money. But for the great mass of the Canadian people, white-collar workers and overall workers alike, people in the middle classes, self-employed people, unless we are prepared to work together, my friends, the future is bleak indeed, and this country never needed a social democratic party nearly as much as it needs it today, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And as we go into a federal election, and perhaps in Ontario, a provincial election, I'm beseeching you to give your wholehearted support to both our national leader and our provincial leader and the provincial leaders in the other provinces. The battle can be won. It'll be won by people like yourselves going out and working in your constituencies and calling on your fellow supporters to work with you. Two things in closing I'll only touch on. I want you, as a movement, to set yourselves to the task of completing the Medicare program. Don't let anyone fool you. That battle is not over. Those who are seeking to go back today are controlling the Tory party. You notice how many of their members stayed out of the House when the bill came up the other day. Didn't have the guts to vote for it, but they don't believe in it, and when the day comes they have an opportunity, they will sabotage Medicare. What we need is not only to preserve the Medicare we have, but to remember that the Medicare we have is only the first step in Medicare. It's only the removal of the financial barrier between those who need care and those who provide it. The next step is to provide a preventive health program in which we'll set up the clinics and set up the facilities which will recognize that keeping people well is just as important as curing those who are ill. And the last thing I want to say as I sit down is that we must stop the drift toward nuclear war. Whether we know it or not, we are slowly being dragged along into by an American government controlled by a man who seems to have no sense of the kind of world in which he lives. And if he is re-elected next fall and he continues to do what he's doing now, dropping mines into the harbors of Nicaragua and other countries, which if any other country did it would be considered an act of war. Even the British and French and German governments have protested because it's a violation of international law, it's a violation of everything the United Nations stands for. This man has no respect for anything except for the economic interests of the tremendous barons who control the economy of the United States and eventually want to control the economy of the world. And where are we? We're being sucked along. Our Prime Minister goes all across the world on a peace mission, with a dove of peace in one hand and a nuclear cruise missile in the other hand. Do you wonder that the country's paid no attention to him? Do you wonder that this yawned in his face? He makes the excuse that, oh, well, you know, we're in a military alliance, we have to go along. But Norway hasn't gone along, Holland hasn't gone along, Switzerland hasn't gone along. The West Germans are protesting the way we're edging toward war. 50,000 nuclear weapons in the world tonight. 100 times as much as is necessary to destroy human life. Wouldn't it be ironical if the first generation of mankind to reach the moon turns out to be the generation that destroys life on this planet? Yet that is what we are heading for. I ask you at this gathering and throughout the weeks and months that lie ahead to dedicate yourselves to a movement which is the only hope of mankind, to give us economic prosperity, to give us decent health care, and to preserve the peace of the world. New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must ever up and onward who would keep abreast of truth. Lo, before us gleam her campfires. We ourselves must pilgrims be, launch our Mayflower and steer boldly through the desperate winter sea, and not attempt to unlock the future with the past's blood-rusted key. Thank you.